Welcome everyone to this remote lecture for product design technologists, how to make a website. So what we're going to cover in this session is some tools that let you format and upload your content, how to prepare your product shots and other images using third-party platforms and social media, and also just a little bit about what kind of content you should include on your site. It's also important to note what we're not going to cover. So this is going to be pretty top level. I'll include some links in the documentation for other resources you can look at. I'm also going to talk specifically here about a professional outward-facing website. So I'm not talking about your studio portfolio or tech manual, although some of the things that we'll cover here I guess could be useful in that. And as this is intended really to be a sort of tech lecture, I'm really going to cover the kind of the techniques, the how of it, rather than the why or the what. So let's start with the basic approaches. What are the things that you fundamentally need to do? You need to format your content. You need to have a place to host that content. You need a way to get your content from your computer onto the web. And then you need a way for people to find it, a domain name. And those tools are bundled up in different ways with different kinds of platforms. And I'm just going to cover some of those basics now. So probably the most common way that most people would build a website today is by using a hosted platform. So these are things like Squarespace, I guess in the design space, things like Adobe Portfolio, WordPress, and also many of the free website builders like Wix. These platforms have lots of nice features. They generally provide an easy to use CMS, an easy to use content management system that lets you format and arrange your content. They have loads of other features built in. They might be able to handle podcasting, e-commerce if you want to sell products, blogging, all sorts of things like that. I think critically, they handle a lot of the annoying technical work. So they handle maintenance of software and servers, security, backing up your work, and they'll also provide new themes and updates as browsers change. And a lot of them also provide really nice templates and themes, so you don't have to start from scratch with a blank page. On the downside, they generally cost money. So there's a monthly fee, which is somewhere in the region of sort of £10 if you want to get those kinds of features. In my experience, they can sometimes be a little temperamental. If you want to use a really complex theme that has lots of nice visual effects, those things don't always work so well on older browsers or on a slow internet connection. Some of the services have more lock-in than others. So it's fine so long as you're paying your £10 a month or whatever it is. But if you decide you don't want to do that, or you want to move to a different service, it can be quite difficult to get your content out. I would say actually WordPress is one of the better examples of that. It's very easy to export your content from WordPress into another service. And while it's tempting to go with a free service, perhaps like Wix, it's worth noting that these often have hitches. Typically, they'll want to display ads on your content, which you definitely don't want to be doing if you're trying to present yourself as a professional designer. And also, they will generally not let you have your own domain name. So even with Wix, for example, although they hide it away, if you actually want to have your own domain name, you have to pay money. And it's kind of in the same ballpark as the other sites, other services like Squarespace and WordPress. The other popular approach, and I suspect this is how most websites are produced, is by using one of these CMSs but hosting it yourself. So you see on the WordPress site, they boast that WordPress powers 36% of the internet. Now most of that's not on their paid service, WordPress.com. Most of that is using their open source software, so the same software that's used on WordPress.com, but you can host on your own site. So you can find that on WordPress.org. So this is exactly the same CMS and has many of the same features in terms of managing your content, but it works slightly differently. You install the software on your own web hosting. So for example, TSO Host is a popular web host here in the UK. They do a WordPress hosting plan, and it's sort of £3 to £4 a month. So much cheaper than hosting on WordPress.com, and you also get lots of other nice features that you can that give you a lot of flexibility in terms of what you want to put online. And because it's open source software, it has a huge community of people building templates and plugins for more advanced functionality. Also, if you want to work with someone else, like a front-end developer, to develop some bespoke functionality that you need, it's very easy to find someone who can work with WordPress. It's open source, it's free to use, and it's proven technology. As they say on their WordPress.com site, something like a third of the web runs on WordPress. Now, it does have some downsides. Because you're self-hosting, you have to maintain it yourself. So that means when there's a new version released, you have to run the update yourself. And if they discover security vulnerabilities, you have to apply the patches yourself. Now, the hosting plans do make this a little bit easier, but still it's something that you need to be aware of. Similarly, if you want to have backups of your content, you need to install backup software and run those backups yourself. Because it's so popular, WordPress in particular is a very popular target for hackers. I used to run a lot of websites for myself and for clients on WordPress, and in the last couple of years I've moved a lot of those away because it became too much of an overhead to deal with A, applying all the patches, and B, dealing with problems when sites did get hacked. The other thing I'd say about WordPress is because it's so big and customizable, it is easy to get lost in the weeds doing all that customization. The same is true with a lot of these services. You can spend a bit too much time fiddling around getting your styles just right and not focusing on doing the work. I've talked about WordPress here, but there are other platforms. Drupal is another popular one, and there's another CMS called Craft, which also offers you a large amount of control. So there's lots of these kind of open source self-hosted platforms. The third approach I'm going to talk about is to use a static site generator. So this is a relatively new way of building a website, and the idea is that you write your content in a very simple format. So you're not writing HTML, you write content in a format called Markdown, which has been around for a long time. It's a very simple way of formatting text and images. You write that on your local computer, and then you use one of these static site generators to convert that into HTML. And that HTML you can then publish to the web. What's really nice about this, I guess there are two main features. Firstly, you're writing in a very simple kind of human readable format, so you're not having to write lots of weird HTML code. Markdown is quite a nice thing to write in. And you're publishing static HTML pages. So they're very easy to host. You can publish that stuff on pretty much any web host. There's very little security risk. You're not executing code on the server, so it's much more difficult for your site to get hacked. And it's very fast. When someone requests a page from your site, they're just seeing a static HTML page. That page doesn't have to be generated each time by the CMS. So in the last 5 years, this has been a much more popular way of hosting a website, and lots of large companies use static site generators to publish their work. As you can see on this page here, there's a list of different generators. There are probably, I don't know, hundreds of different generators you could choose from. However, there are some pretty basic places to start. Perhaps the most popular generator is called Jekyll. I think this was probably the software that started it all. And this is as good an engine to start with as any. Another popular one is called Hugo. I would say the simplest place to start is GitHub Pages. So GitHub is a platform mostly for hosting code. And Pages is their service that's really designed to help developers produce easy documentation. But you can, in fact, host any website on GitHub Pages. And if you have a domain name, you could even point your domain name to that site, so it doesn't have to look like it's on GitHub. And under the hood, GitHub Pages uses Jekyll, but you don't have to install Jekyll or fiddle with any code to get it to work. So this is actually quite a simple way to use a static site generator, to use your own domain name, and get all of the benefits of that without many of the drawbacks of fiddling with, for example, installing command line tools. However, as the name might suggest, GitHub Pages kind of assumes you're using GitHub or perhaps more specifically Git, which is a version control system. So that's great if you're using Git, perhaps if you're working in a team with some developers, or it's just something that's part of your existing workflow. It's also great if you like working with Markdown, but perhaps not everyone does. So I would say if If these are tools which sound interesting to you, or you're already kind of using them as part of a workflow, then this is a great way to go. And in fact, this is how I build most of my websites now. But I enjoy playing with this stuff. So if terms like version control and Git and Markdown just seem like gobbledygook or not something you want to get involved in, then I would probably suggest you go with one of the other approaches. I think it would be remiss of me not to say that you could, of course, write your own HTML by scratch like this. You could write that in any text editor. This is quite simple HTML, and publish that to the web. But I think if your focus is on producing a professional design showcase or portfolio site, then you're getting too far into the weeds if you're writing your own HTML. So those are perhaps the most popular approaches for building a website. And then the question is how do you decide between them? Of course, this is a kind of classic design decision. There's trade-offs that you've got to make, and you've got to figure out what's important to you, and also perhaps more importantly, where there is flexibility and where there isn't. So here's some reasons, some things that might be important. You might want to have control to have a really convenient solution. You might be concerned about security and maintenance. That tends to be something you get more concerned about after you've had some problems. I would stress you need to be very focused on owning your work. So that means that you're not dependent on a third party, a platform which may change its business model. It may go out of business. It might raise its prices. All sorts of things which are out of your control. There are also some things which are easy to change later. So it's easy perhaps to change the look and feel of your website. But if your website, for example, or the platform you're using, for example, has like a strange URL scheme, like it puts things in funny directories or uses URLs, query strings, like these strange numbers and characters. If you then move your website to a different platform down the line, all your URLs are going to break and people aren't going to be able to find your work. As I mentioned before, lock-in is a really key factor. Services want you to keep paying them £10 a month for years to come. So some of them make it very difficult to get your work out. I would say in my experience, WordPress is actually pretty good at that. And certainly the first thing, or one of the first things I would do if I was trialing any of these in this kind of, free 2-week, 1-month trial, is put some content in and then look at the export options and see how easy it is to get the content out and in what formats. That lock-in factor becomes more and more of a problem the longer you're with a service and the more invested you are with it. So I would suggest that you get a very simple domain name, yourname.com. If you can't get that, then obviously you're going to have to be a bit more creative. Ideally, I would suggest managing your domain separately from wherever you host your website. So for example, if you're using WordPress or Squarespace, try and host your domain somewhere else so that you can manage it independently. If you choose to change your CMS, it's easy to map your domain to a different CMS. Now, that being said, most of the CMS providers offer deals. So for the first year, you'll get, for example, a free domain name. And that's probably worth doing, but you should just check that you can move your content and your domain somewhere else if you want to. As I mentioned before, be very careful about lock-in. You want to make sure that you can get all of your content, your text and images out in a format that you can then easily use somewhere else. And I will be very wary about free deals. They seem very tempting. They provide everything that you need without you spending any money, but generally there are hitches. So generally they'll put ads on your stuff, or you'll have to use their domain name, not your own. And that's not a good way to create a professional impression. There is another approach which I've not talked about really, and that's basically because I don't advise it. You can host your content entirely on another platform. Now, there are lots of platforms which are optimized for different kinds of content. These are some common ones. I'm going to come back to these platforms later because I do think that you should be using them, but I don't think this should be your home on the web. Now, it's tempting when a platform rises to prominence to think that you should embrace it in that way. But I think you should learn a lesson from all of the platforms that were once dominant and seemed unstoppable and are now long forgotten. Again, this comes back to owning your work. Definitely make use of platforms that are out there, social networks and so on, but make sure that you have a place that you control, that you own, that you can point people to. So let's talk about content. What should you actually put on your site? Well, it's not rocket science. You essentially need to show off your work and you need to say something about yourself. So obviously for a young emerging designer, showing your work is going to be a little bit more difficult than for a more established designer. And I would say there's perhaps a couple of approaches you need to take here. Firstly, resist the temptation to show absolutely everything. The chances are that someone visiting your site is going to have a small amount of time, at least initially, and they want to see the very best work. So make sure that your best work is up front. And secondly, your work might consist largely of university projects and perhaps some commercial work you did on placement or an early job or some work you've done for a friend, for example. And it may be that some of that work doesn't really represent who you want to be as a designer. And that's why it's important to develop your own projects, side projects. Projects that let you express who you want to be, who you aspire to be, and communicate that to other people. So by making your own projects, you can create the kind of work that you want to get as a designer. And I would be upfront about all of that work, present it as it is, and present it with equal importance. The self-developed projects are just as important as the commercial work or the university projects, perhaps more so. And related to that, obviously you need to talk about yourself, and there's some sort of basic fundamentals. You need to have a way for people to contact you, and you need to have some sort of biographical information. But I think more importantly, you need to communicate something of what you believe in. Now that might be as blunt as a manifesto. It might be talking about the things that interest you or the problems you'd like to solve. And it might be that you don't perhaps know exactly what you believe in, but I think you should try and put a stake in the ground, even if you decide to move that stake further down the line. So how do you present your work? Well, as I've already said, I think you need to make sure that you prioritize the best work. But there are a few things that you need to show when you're presenting any project. Here's an example of a very well-known design agency, Pentagram, who I think do a good job of showing their work. Obviously, they have huge resources that you're not going to have access to, but I think some of the lessons, the fundamentals you can learn from. So firstly, you need really strong visuals. I think secondly, as they've done up here at the top, you need to say exactly what it is that people are looking at. So in this case, they've talked about the product itself in simple language, and then they've also talked about what they did. So that might well be the case where you're working in a team where you're not responsible for everything, but you need to communicate the role that you played. And then they've got some nice images down here to show the product in different situations. And then they talk a little bit about the development of the project. So in this case, they talk about their research process. Now, in this particular case, I don't think that's a particularly interesting way of describing that process. But they do further on talk about one of the insights that came out of that. And then they provide a way for you to learn more about this on a separate page. So I think if you want to prioritize a user-centered design approach, for example, then you need to talk about, in simple terms, talk about what you did, but most importantly, what was the insight that you learned. If you think that your process is valuable, then you've got to demonstrate why it's valuable. There's another nice thing I like about this, which is it shows the product in use by people. It's very easy just to show product shots or renders or UIs photoshopped onto phones that are floating in space. But that kind of imagery lacks weight. If you can possibly show your product in situ, in use with people, then I think that's a far stronger way to tell the story. Now, what about style? This can be a tricky question, even if you're using a pre-made template provided by your CMS. As a designer, you probably want to be adventurous. You want to show your design skills, and style and visual interface is a way of doing that. And if doing that on the web is an area you have competency in or something that you want to develop, then I think you should absolutely go for it. If on the other hand you're stuck or that's not your area of expertise, then I would suggest you keep it simple. If you have too many options, it becomes too difficult. So perhaps set yourself some constraints. Give yourself a couple of colors, one typeface in 2 weights or 2 sizes, and one grid to lay everything out on. Here's a nice example of really nicely designed site that uses a very constrained set of colors, typefaces, and layouts. Here's another good example of a design agency that I think has A, does really good work, and B, has a nice website. Now their work is, they hope is progressive, and I think their design, it also tries to be progressive without being difficult to use. But you can see that they're using very simple techniques. Now, if you find a site like this that you like the look of, it's not cheating in the world of web design to see how they've done it and if there are things that you can learn from that. And the simplest way to do that is to view the page source for the page you're looking at. Now, you might want to look at a particular style sheet, maybe to see what typeface they've used, but you can also perhaps just learn what platform they're using. So for example, they might be using a Squarespace theme that you would also like to use. Now in this case, I can see from their source code, they have a lot of these WP directories, WP includes, and that's a standard WordPress directory structure. So although they're using their own theme, their own Europa theme, you can tell at least that they're using that platform. So in this case, it might be that if you wanted to evaluate whether WordPress was going to work for you and you wanted to do this kind of layout, this would at least be a kind of reassurance that that is possible. Now your content is probably going to be largely words, images, and rich media. I'm not going to talk about words particularly. Obviously there's a great art to writing well about your work, and that's not something I can cover here, but I will talk about, well, specifically about images. Now you're probably used to generating high quality images of your work. So that might be photographing your project or photographing your work in progress using maybe a smartphone. It might be doing renders from CAD software. All of that imagery is going to be very large file sizes, so maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 megabyte photos that are coming off your phone. Now that's full of quality and it's good to have, and it's good for graphic design, but that's not going to work on the web. So to download an 8 megabyte photo is just going to take too long. So you need to be conscious particularly of the file size of your graphics. Another thing you need to think about is the format, and generally there are probably two formats you're going to use: PNG or PNG, which is generally good for flat colors and graphic design kind of elements, and then JPEG, which is good for more complex or organic imagery like photographs or things with lots of texture. You need to think about the dimensions of those images. Typically the images off your phone are far too large or far larger than you need to go on a website. And that's complicated now by having lots of HD screens everywhere where the pixel count of the screen is kind of different to the way the browser sees it. You need to make judicious use of compression. So compression applied well can reduce the file size without really reducing the quality in any visible way. But compression applied too heavily can make your images look terrible. And obviously you need to find tools that will let you do all this, of which there are many. Let's just talk a little bit about resolution, and in particular about HD displays. So a lot of modern laptops, and I guess most modern phones, have HD, or perhaps they're called Retina displays. So that's the term that Apple uses. So for example, this laptop that I'm using has a display resolution which, as they say, looks like 1792 by 1120, but actually there are twice as many pixels in each dimension as that. And the same is true of mobiles. Again, these are Apple phones, but the same applies for Android phones. They generally have what they call a point dimension. So for example, the largest of these ones here is 896 by 414 points, but the actual pixels are twice that. So again, if you wanted to have an image that filled the entire screen of this, you need to have an image that was 1792 by 828 pixels. In terms of software, you've got many options. If you're using Photoshop or Lightroom or any kind of photo editor, you'll probably have some options there to resize and to set compression for your images. But I would say one of the best ways to do this is to use a dedicated image optimization app. There are plenty available. This is one I use for the Mac. It's called Image Optim, which lets you set some parameters about how much you want to compress things and then does all that compression for you. Now there are lots of these apps available for all platforms, and there are also lots of websites that will do it for you. And I think the little demo here gives a good indication of the benefits of that. An image which is half the size will take half the time to download. So let's just look at a very image intensive page, one that has lots of what look like high-res images, and see what some of the sizes look like. So if I go to the developer tools, so these are available in most browsers, Safari, Chrome and Firefox all have something like this. And look at the page resources. So here on this network tab, we get a good indication, firstly of all the resources that make up the page, and over here these bars, how long it took to download them all, but also what sizes they are. So here's one of their hero shots. And if we look at this tab, we can see it's only 47K. So if you've got some photographs of your work that are 4, 5, 6 megabytes off your phone, this gives you an indication of how much you need to compress them to get them down ready for the web. Let's just talk a little bit about other media, particularly video. I would suggest that if you've got anyone somewhere like YouTube, rather than embedding the media directly on your site. That's because YouTube has a far better content delivery network and dynamic streaming settings, so it can handle getting the video to your site visitor much better than you can. And that's pretty easy to do. There's instructions on the YouTube website. You essentially just copy the embed code from any video that you want to share. You might also want to embed a 3D model. Now it might be that you've got a render which could be in video format, but if you want to, for example, share an STL file, there are lots of services that will let you do that. Here's an article that lists many of them. The one that I would recommend, the one I've used myself, is provided by GitHub. They have a file viewer for STLs that you've uploaded to a GitHub repository, and that certainly handles showing STLs quite well. Here's a simple example. You can rotate and zoom and so on. And finally, I just want to talk about how you work with other platforms. It's no longer the case that just having a website is enough. And certainly for specific use cases, you should be engaging people elsewhere. Now these platforms change all the time. They become more or less popular, but here are a few that are currently, I guess, popular within certain categories. Now I would suggest that you choose carefully from a list like this and try to figure out where the people who are looking for what you're producing, where those people are. So if, for example, you're producing very UI or visual design work, then perhaps posting some of your work up on Dribble or Behance is a good place to be. If you're more interested in distributed design, then perhaps Wikifactory or even Instructables. If you're working in a more kind of technical field and you want to work with perhaps developers, then GitHub is a good place to be. People have strong views about different social media platforms. I personally don't really like LinkedIn, but it's undeniable that many potential employers are going to be using it. So it's probably a good place to be. Blogging is itself an activity that takes a huge amount of time. If it's something that you want to invest that time in, then by all means start blogging, perhaps on a platform like Medium that kind of hosts it all for you. And again, if you're producing very visual work, then there are visual focused social media like Instagram. Even Tumblr actually is another good one for sharing that kind of work. So I would say take part in all these platforms or take part in the relevant ones for you, but make sure that you always own your work. Don't let these platforms be the only place where your work is found. Okay, that's it for this lecture. I will include some links in the description for this video, but also on Student Central. Thank you.